Now, earlier I mentioned that the Lord, when He called me, said specifically, this is what I want you to do. And the antecedent is evangelism. That's what Earl Cleveland did, and did in an excellent way. God never told me I would be as good at it as he was, and I never expected that. But I could do it. I could do that work. God would prepare me to do that work. And so it was well known that I was prepared at Oakwood to be a minister, and I wanted to be what I called a pastor evangelist. There were several of us in that class who felt the same way, because an evangelist is always a guest or a visitor. But a pastor evangelist stays with the people he has baptized, and you don't have those ordinary losses, at least not to the extent as when the minister leaves and goes on and another pastor takes over. And so as soon as we were hired, they announced that we would be sent out into the field with various seasoned evangelists. The one that I was to go with was Elder J. Gershom Dasent, a mighty preacher of prophecy. He went to a small town in western Pennsylvania, a coal mining town, Uniontown. And he set up a tent, and I was a tent master. Now, a tent master couldn't go anywhere. He had to stay close because he guarded all of the equipment, and Elder Dasent had gobs of slides and projectors and microphones and all of that. So my work essentially was to stay there. But on some days he would come early, and then I would get out into the field. That's how it all began. I probably shouldn't mention this, but I'm going to. Elder Dasent is asleep in Jesus. He was a conservative, wonderful, powerful preacher. But for some reason, the people who knew him got the impression that he was austere, and therefore I wouldn't enjoy my work. I'm so glad I never allowed things like that to bother me. Elder Dasent had a small tent put up as an office, and mine was over here, and he would arrive often at around 3 o'clock, and he would wait until meeting time at 7:30. But he would study, and he would type out things, and then there were times when I'd just go sit on the floor and listen to his wisdom. And he taught me things. He taught me things not to do, as well as things that I ought to do. He taught me from a vast background of experience, including administration, and he gave me every opportunity to try my wings. As a matter of fact, I had never seen this done before. He was the speaker for this 8-week meeting, but he announced to the people on a certain night that I was going to preach. And he allowed it, and he gave me a tough subject. I was to preach prophecy from the animals, these beasts of Daniel, and I was to preach on Daniel 7. And I thought, wow. But he said, the Lord blessed. It went very well. He was also interested in me as a person, and he wanted me to grow. He was interested in my interests. And so he worked it out on his own volition for me to have 2 long weekends to drive with some others to Pine Forge, where my beloved lived. That was the beginning for me. The very next year, I wanted to go where everybody else seemed to be going, to work with Elder Cleveland. Administration called me in and said, no, Brooks, we want you to run your own. We think you're ready. They assigned me Chester, Pennsylvania. Now, I love to tell this. I used to tell it to young preachers that they had me counseling. I'd say, you know, we put up a tent, and though we had fierce storms and awful experiences, we doubled our membership. And they look in awe. Double the membership? Then I'd have to tell them I only had 22 members. So the doubling of the membership wasn't quite as awesome as they might have expected. But I learned early the value of one soul. Ellen White says in the book Evangelism, one soul is worth more than the whole world. Therefore, when I did evangelism, I wasn't hung up on numbers. I wanted to baptize as many as possible. But I certainly was not going to make shortcuts in order to do it. I'm not going to compromise. If you join, you're going to know why you're in, and if you're not ready for that, then stay out. And that's been my approach to evangelism ever since. From there we went to South Philly and had even more success and blessings. And from there we moved to Camden. And Camden was a place where the mayor said I could run a meeting, but some lady who was the secretary said, "You're not going to run a meeting." And you simply couldn't. I had come to the point of exasperation. I was going to put up my pavilion and run the meeting without permission. And if the people came, as they always did, they would take care of the political points of view. I figured I'd better do this. Well, I didn't do it because one of our comrades was at the point of death and asked that I would run his meeting in Virginia. And I went to Danville instead. As soon as I began to preach in Danville, a great big man walked up to the rostrum one night. He said, "You're Pastor Brooks?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm John Brooks." He said, "I am one of the operators at WBTM, a radio station. How would you like to come on and tell the people all over the area what you're telling out here?" I said, "When can I begin?" He said, "Tonight." So I jumped in my car and went straight to the radio station without preparation, and he gave me the opportunity every night of preaching the same sermon in miniature that had been presented at the main pavilion. Now his job was to close up shop every night. He went till either 12:30 or 1, and he usually played dance music for the people all through. And the phone would ring, and they would wonder, "Why can't we have..." He said, "I'm sorry, but there's something more important tonight." My wife was in summer school and drove down to be with me. He was looking forward to her arrival. He had never met her. And on that night, even after I had finished what I had to do, he began to play the soft, beautiful love ballads that I liked. And they wanted something with a lot of energy so they could do the wild dancing. He said, "No, tonight everything is sweet and easy in honor of a special guest in town." But the important thing is the Lord gave us baptisms, that including a minister or two, and these have lasted until this very day. While many of my loved ones are asleep in Jesus, wherever I go, I find their children, or I find them with hoary heads, always delighted to see each other in Christ Jesus. Danville, Virginia. I didn't get to run a meeting in Camden. They moved me to Columbus, Ohio. We did 2 or 3 meetings there, every one of them blessed. Hey, there's something I want to tell you about that first meeting in Columbus, and in order for you to get it, I have to go back to Oakwood. I had just gotten to Oakwood. Now remember, I had just come out of the world too. And when you're around wonderful people and holy people, you feel so unworthy, and I did. And I'm sitting in church once that place is packed, and Elder C.E. Mosley is preaching. And what a mighty sermon. You just feel like you're going to break out in I don't know, at any minute. It was so powerful, and I'm not that emotional. At least I wasn't. And after he had been preaching about 35 minutes, I saw something I had never seen in my life. A young man who had been known to be worldly got up from his seat, walked down the aisle, and stood right before Elder Mosley, weeping his heart out. Now, the important thing is, no appeal had been made. There had been no break. There had not been an invitation. He just got up and went down there. And I thought, what is this? I'd always heard an appeal. Next thing I knew, 2 or 3 ladies, 2 or 3 other guys. By the time it was over, I imagined 35 or 40 people were standing down there, and Elder Mosley just kept preaching. He had never offered an appeal. Oh, I don't need to tell you what an impact that had. To me, it was a direct manifestation of the Holy Spirit working with a man of God. And I felt so small. Lord, isn't that something? If I can never be that kind of man, aim me in that direction. Columbus. Big tent in a nice area. meetings going well, crowds every night. I always like to use images on the screen to recap my sermon. And every night there'd come a point where I would turn off the lights and go to the screen, and then I wanted to end up with Christ in his passion on the cross. And I had been running for perhaps 4 or 5 weeks. This was an 8-week campaign. And when the lights went out, almost suddenly, I saw the whole back row stand up and began to move. Well, I had learned a long time ago you must pray as you preach. 2 different things, but they're happening together. And so I'm praying, Lord, did I offend these people? The truth is not easy, but it's never sent in that spirit. Did I offend them by something I said? I'm virtually searching while continuing to preach. But as these people got to the center, instead of going out, they started toward me. And I thought, what is this? And I'm continuing to preach. And when they got close enough for the light on the screen to illuminate their faces, I saw people who had been coming and enjoying the word every night. In fact, there was an older woman, her daughter who was middle-aged, her grandchildren, her son, a whole family. And they came and just stood. My Lord, this is that. This is what happened with Elder Mosley. Why would the Lord honor me this way after 7 or 8 years in the ministry? But it happened, and others kept coming. About 26 came without an invitation that night. We had a great meeting, baptized a total of 125. And I went to talk to this dear lady many times. She was a lovely person. She's asleep now, and her daughter is too, for that matter. But I went to see her, and she told me her story. She picked up the handbill, and we like to use catchy, provocative titles, hoping they'll hook someone. And she said she read it, and then she picked up the phone, called her daughter, said, listen to what. And she read the subjects. And she said, let's go see what this fool is talking about. And they came, and they never missed a night, and she was a part of that great manifestation. Evangelism in Columbus, other great things, but we can't tell everything. I want to say this, however. Souls are not won by preachers. They're not won by human talent and ingenuity. Souls are won by the Holy Ghost. And therefore, I sincerely have said to many of my congregations, more is accomplished by prayer than by preaching. If we live as we ought, pray as we ought, trust as we ought, God says do the work and leave the results with him. And don't ever be embarrassed that one number doesn't equal another, because one soul is worth more than the whole world. I went next to Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland was a big, strong, powerful church and had been for years. I was still in my 20s. I was told this by one of the fine deacons in Cleveland long after I'd been there. Elder Starks had been my predecessor and had highly recommended me. And the administration did too. So when the decision was made, some of these men, rightfully so, these concerned men, went to administration and said, look, Cleveland has problems. We big church. Do you think a young man in his 20s can fit here? I'm grateful that somebody said, don't worry about Brooks, he'll be all right. Cleveland was a joy. It was my last church, and when I think of pastoring, I think of Cleveland and the many facets of ministry connected with that fact. Cleveland was a place of great people, strong spirituality, wonderful cooperation, good school, good help. And we almost immediately began to plan for evangelism in the summer in a pavilion. When the time came, we hoped to have had our entire congregation excited about it. I used to talk about a crescendo of excitement which we wanted to reach around mid-July. That's about when the meeting started. Now, the truth is, I'd rather start in June, but Cleveland is a northern city, and it would be too cool at nights in June. So we would start in July, and the people would come, and we would go into September, and it would get very cool. But I didn't worry about that because I felt under God that if the people came, they'd continue to come. So we would put salamanders and other heating devices in the tents and keep on going. The first effort that we did was behind Brown's Service Station. We went down there, and Elder Robert Palmer volunteered to become my associate. And oh, what a great time. There's some things that happened that are worth noting. The devil hates evangelism, and it's his job to try to stop you or discourage you or inconvenience you or throw you off schedule. Do whatever he can. We are only able to go because of the goodness of the Lord. And so we were into that meeting, and people were enjoying the meeting, and the paper said that that evening a hurricane, the effect of a hurricane would come through Cleveland. And I thought, what? To be honest with you, the sun was shining beautifully when I read the announcement. You couldn't believe it based on appearances. But I called Palmer and I said, Bob, we'd better go down and do what we do to prepare because this is what I hear. We jumped in our car. It seemed almost foolish. Beautiful sunny day. We drive down, and immediately we pick up the hammers and we start tightening our pavilion. It must be loose in the rain, tight in the wind. We knew about it, and we started doing it. We had just about made the entire circle of the tent. When I looked, I remember my words, Bob, look at this. And approaching us from the west was a darkness like a blanket being pulled over a sunny sky. And then the storm hit. I want to tell you, it was furious. It got so bad that I gave up for the night. I kicked my pulpit over. I took my foot and knocked the railing down. These things will destroy canvas. And I had it all flat on the ground. I ordered all chairs to be thrown flat on the ground. And we were getting ready for the worst storm you can imagine. We heard limbs breaking off trees. It was crazy. When all of a sudden, a dozen or more men piled underneath the walls and came and stood with me. And I said, what are you doing here? They said, we came to help. And then here come more men. And I said, I tell you what let's do. Gather around this pole and let's pray. Now I'm saying this to the glory of God, not for any personal reason at all. I got sense enough to know that either God does or he doesn't. And we began to pray. And before we finished praying, you could hear a whisper. I said, gentlemen, let's have church. Set the chairs up. We got a hammer and we started re-nailing because our railings had been kicked down with all the pretty drapery. It didn't even get dirty. We picked it up and started strengthening it again. When the folk realized that we were doing it, because I ordered the walls up so that we could get some air, they were on people's porches without permission. Dozens of them all up and down the street. And in just moments, the tent was packed as usual. We had the walls down because we heard a little rain, and we wanted to make sure we protected the people. Suddenly, there was no sound, and I said to my men, get the walls up, let some air flow through. And when they opened the walls, people were standing on the outside under umbrellas, listening. I got a vision of what it means to hunger and thirst for righteousness. I believe it's still true. There are men and women who see the desperate distresses going on in this world today, the storms, the tsunamis, the wars, the terrorism. They see this and they hunger to know a way out of this. And they're looking for people who know how to cope. God showed us that in Cleveland. We baptized 125 in the first campaign, 208 in the second, 130 in the third. God was good. The church that I pastored as a second church, we gave entirely to Pastor Robert Palmer, and he took off like a rocket, became president of the conference, now retired, but one of the great men of the church. His congregation grew, my congregation grew. We became the largest church in the Allegheny Territory, the Cleveland Glenville Church. I shall never forget how God honored us there. Oh, there were so many things we accomplished. I don't have time to tell it all. But all of a sudden, something happened. I got a letter from the administrator of the Columbia Union Conference. This is a second level of administration in our church hierarchy. And he said, we are extending an official call for you to come and join the Columbia Union, be a part of us. Well, to be dead honest with you, I remembered the call. This is what I want you to do. As far as I was concerned, that meant pastoring and evangelizing. And you get into church administration and lecturing and all of that. I couldn't see the compatibility. So I officially said no. I got a second letter from the same man. I officially said no. And I want to pause to say, I have met thousands upon thousands of men, good men. But I have never met a man like Neil C. Wilson, who was the president of the union at that time. I've never met a man like him, a man who could empathize and sympathize, who was totally unaffected by race, who insisted on getting things in order the way God had directed. Now, that's the truth. And so after the second official notification that I wouldn't come, and I tried to do it in the nicest way, with deep and sincere appreciation, I was pitching camp. Now, when you pitch camp for camp meeting, you get real dirty and sweaty, and I was associate superintendent of all that. And I'm working in the hot sun and dirty as I could be. And a man drove out and said, Pastor Brooks, there's a phone call for you from Washington, and you may take it on that field telephone there. I walked over and said hello. I didn't know who it was. Neil C. Wilson. Totally unaffected by my refusals, showing me why he needed me. And again, I'm trying my best to be grateful and to show it. But I said, Elder, that isn't what God called me to do. He said, how do you know? And we had quite a discussion. And finally he said, well, are you telling me to look for someone else? And I said, very respectfully, sir, I suppose that's what I'm saying. He said, all right, if you won't come to see me, I'm coming to see you. Bam. He's coming to see me. Now I'm going to confess to all my friends something that I'm ashamed of. Until he said those words, I had never even prayed about that call. I'm pastoring the biggest church. I am being able to baptize hundreds. Why should I want to do that? Besides, there was a racial problem that hadn't healed. I didn't realize that God was using Neil Wilson to heal it. So after I hung up with him, I called my wife back in Cleveland and told her about it. And I said, darling, at least we must pray. And I tell you the truth, as soon as we did it, my mind was as clear as that. You go to the union. But the next day, dirty, sweaty, time for lunch. And we fellas loved each other. It didn't matter who was at your table. We had a good time together. I walked to the door of the dining room, and someone came and said, Pastor Brooks, there's a gentleman over there who wants to see you. Neil Wilson. He came up the very next day and brought along with him one of his associates, Carl Weiss. Now I've got to go to that man's table looking like I looked. But a man of understanding was he. I apologized for he said, don't mention it. We know what you've been doing. We're just thankful for this moment with you. Go get your food and come join us. And I did. And Elder Wilson began all over again like I had never said no. And then he asked Weiss to say something. Weiss, a good man. He was in lay activities. And he said, Brooks, I want you to consider that if you come here, you've got a larger budget, you'll have more personal perks, you'll have this. And he began to outline. I thought, and I stopped him. I said, Elder, please forgive me, but I don't need pampering. That's not what this is about. I said, Elder Wilson, I am very pleased to tell you that I had not prayed about this item until you said what you did yesterday. In the meantime, my wife and I have been speaking together in prayer, and this morning our hearts are fixed. God has told me to go with you. And that was that. I had 4 assignments to begin with, and they were to speak at human relations seminars, usually from 2,500 to 3,500 people, about equally Caucasian and non-Caucasian. Now, I'm given to plain speech. Everybody knows that, but I have no desire to be mean or rough. I just want to be clear and plain. And my job was to be keynote speaker at 4 of these seminars around the Columbia Union Territory. I'm grateful that they went very well. I told the people for the first time, I don't know why I was embarrassed about this, but I told the people I had graduated from college, had been hired in the ministry, had been doing that work for a year when I married a very beautiful lady, herself well educated. We got married not in Mississippi, but in Philadelphia. And we drove out of Philadelphia that evening on our honeymoon. And I stopped at 8 or 9 motels that looked at me and refused us entrance. Some of them had the sign up, vacancy. I got to the place I would simply say, I'd like that vacancy you're advertising. And they would come up with all kinds of excuses. The last one I stopped at, I by that time was getting disgusted. And when he started telling me that someone had called ahead to take that vacancy, I said, first of all, you insult me because of my race. And now you're insulting my intelligence. You know good and well you're not telling the truth. Well, he said, we used to take coloreds in here, but they got to bring in women. I said, and I don't want to hear that either.